A group of friends, Anton, Lisa, Danilo, Ole, and Marina, set out on an adventure that, in their opinion, was supposed to be an exciting study. They intended to spend the night in the abandoned village of Zanurivka, which had long attracted attention for its strange legend. There were no shadows in this place. The legend said that the shadows disappeared due to a deal with an ancient spirit, but the youth did not believe in such tales. They decided to check everything with their own eyes. As the minibus approached the village, the atmosphere around changed. The forest road led through thick trees, and the darkness hung like a heavy dome above the heads. Anton, who was driving the car, was constantly looking in the rearview mirror, watching his friends. All of them were full of mixed feelings: curiosity, adrenaline, and slight fear. Lisa sat next to Anton and held the camera in her hands all the time, ready to capture every moment of this mystical journey. She wanted to believe that the legend about the village was just superstition, but at the same time she had hope for something incredible. "It will be simply incredible," Liza smiled, turning the camera to Danilo's face, who was sitting behind. "All these stories about missing shadows are complete nonsense. You see, we will find only old houses here and take cool photos." Oleg, who was sitting at the very end of the bus, nervously rubbed the red thread on his wrist, an amulet from his grandmother. He did not share the confidence of his friends. Something about this place seemed wrong to him. The silence that stood around was too deep, and the darkness that surrounded them seemed to press on their consciousness. When they reached Zanurivka, the first thing that struck them was how dead this village was. Half-ruined houses stood among the weeds, as if forgotten by time. Lisa excitedly got out of the van and immediately started taking pictures, while the others also got out, looking around. Danilo cheerfully approached one of the buildings, trying to look inside through a broken window. "Hey, there's nothing here, just old furniture," he commented, calling Marina over to him. Probably this village was abandoned several dozen years ago. But it was at this moment that Marina, who was standing next to the bus, noticed something very strange. She looked under her feet and did not see her shadow. She looked back at Anton, who was standing next to her. "Where are shadows?" she asked in surprise, her voice shaking with slight anxiety. Anton looked down and then looked back at the others. The sun had not yet set below the horizon, and its rays illuminated them, but neither of them cast a shadow. Not from people, not from the car, not even from the trees standing around. Lisa picked up the camera and pointed it at the ground, hoping it was just an effect of the angle of view, but nothing changed. There were no shadows. Danilo came closer, trying to find a rational explanation. "It must be some kind of optical effect or anomaly," he said, though he wasn't entirely sure. "We simply do not know all the physical reasons, but there is definitely nothing supernatural here." Oleg did not look so optimistic. He remembered his grandmother's words. "The shadow is a part of the soul. Where there are no shadows, something takes them away." He felt a cold sweat on his forehead and couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone here. The friends decided to go further to the center of the village to find a place to camp. They walked along the old street, which was littered with debris and thickly overgrown with weeds. The empty windows of the houses stared at them like empty eyes. Only a deep silence accompanied them, and even the wind seemed to bypass the place. Anton suddenly stopped. In the window of one of the houses, he saw some movement, something that looked like a human figure, but when he looked closely, there was nothing there. His gaze remained fixed on the dark hole, and he couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. "What is there?" Lisa asked, noticing that Anton had stopped and was looking carefully out the window. "Nothing, it just seemed like it," he said, trying not to show his true feelings. He didn't want the others to panic, too. With every step they took, they felt that something invisible was following them. The shadows disappeared, but now the friends understood that this place was not deserted for a reason. There was something here, something that didn't want them to stay, and at the same time wasn't going to let them go. The friends reached the main square of the village. It was a small, open area with a dilapidated well in the center and a few old benches that were so covered in moss and dust that you couldn't even sit on them. Dusk was already beginning to fall on the village, and with the darkness came a sense of tension. Anton and Danilo began to set up tents. They worked in silence, occasionally glancing at the houses around them, as if checking to see if anyone was watching them. Lisa took out her flashlight and began to shine it, helping the boys. Oleg, on the other hand, kept aloof, standing nearby and still not leaving the feeling that something was wrong. "It's all some crazy joke," he muttered under his breath, clutching the thread on his wrist. His eyes slid over the dark windows, which seemed to draw the gaze towards him. Marina, wanting to relax the atmosphere a little, decided to make hot tea using a small, portable force. Her attempts to appear calm could not hide the tension she felt. The village was quiet, too quiet. Even at night, there had to be some sounds. The sound of the wind in the leaves, the sounds of insects, at least the rustling of nocturnal animals. But there was nothing here. Darkness gradually filled the space, as if covering them with a blanket. The first few hours passed in half-silent conversations and attempts to entertain each other with jokes. Lisa took a few photos with a flashlight, trying to give the whole thing a comical feel, but the laughs were forced, and each of them felt it. It seemed that with the darkness came some invisible force that gripped their chests with fear. When full night came, they were sitting by a small fire, which Danilo still decided to light. The fire burned unevenly, throwing strange reflections on the faces of friends. Oleg suddenly leaned forward, peering into the darkness beyond the campfire. "Do you hear that?" he whispered, as if afraid of scaring something with his voice. The others stopped, listening. It seemed that in the distance, somewhere between the trees, someone was quietly whispering. It wasn't the wind, and it wasn't the animals. It was a whisper, low, faint, but clear, like someone whispering old, forgotten words. "That can't be true," Lisa said, her voice shaking. She tried to capture what she heard on camera, but the lens could capture nothing but darkness. "I don't like it," said Anton, getting up and looking around. His sense of anxiety turned into real fear. Something wasn't right about this place. He could feel something invisible thickening around them, something they couldn't understand. Danilo, who tried to remain positive until the end, also began to doubt. He approached Oleg and lightly shook his shoulder. "We must stay together," he said. "Now is not the time to panic." But it was too late. The darkness that engulfed the village was not simply the absence of light. She was alive, as if she had her own consciousness and intentions. The whispering grew louder and now seemed to come from all directions. It seemed as if something invisible was circling around them, getting closer every minute. Oleg suddenly looked under his feet, and his heart sank. There on earth there was nothing. No shadow from the fire, from his body, from friends. The darkness absorbed even the light, leaving nothing behind. He raised his head in fright and saw how in the darkness, between the houses, some ghostly figures were moving, shadows that seemed to live their own lives. "They want us," Oleg whispered, stepping back. His words were barely audible, but everyone in the camp understood what he meant. Those shadows weren't just gone. They were different now, and they sought to take what had once been taken. Anton and Danilo grabbed the lanterns, but even the bright light could not penetrate through the dense darkness. The figures drew closer, their silhouettes becoming clearer, and now one could see the outlines of former humans who seemed to have lost their human features. They moved toward the fire, slowly but inevitably. Panicking, Lisa rushed to the van, waving for the others to follow her, but the darkness already surrounded them from all sides, and the whispers became deafening. They sounded in their heads, filling every corner of consciousness. "We have to get out of here!" she shouted, but her voice was drowned in an ominous whisper. Everyone began to retreat, but each of them felt an invisible force squeezing their chest, pulling them back into the very depths of darkness. The figures approached, and when they were close enough, the friends realized that these shadows were their own, taken in years gone by, and now they were coming back for the rest, their souls. The village of Zanurivka did not want to be left behind. It was a place where shadows and souls became part of this strange world. And now that the sun had finally set, the darkness engulfed the friends, and with every second, they felt a part of themselves disappearing irrevocably. Darkness continued to squeeze the village of Zanurivka, enveloping friends from all sides. They felt an invisible force engulfing them, leaving no possibility of escape. Marina, trembling, held Lisa's hand, while Danilo tried to find the flashlight that had fallen from his hands. Anton and Oleg stood next to each other, almost without moving. They understood that they were surrounded by beings that none of them could fully understand. The shadows closing in on them weren't just the absence of light. They had form and consciousness, as if they embodied all the lost hopes, all the parts of the people they had left behind. They carried a void within them, and anyone who looked at them felt their own essence gradually disappear, becoming a part of this darkness. Oleg tried to say something, but could not utter a single word. His body became heavy and his consciousness began to seem hazy, as if shadows were taking away his thoughts one by one. He fell to his knees and his eyes closed. He could feel his own shadow pulling away from him, becoming an entity of its own, as if he were losing his soul. Liza saw that Oleg was falling and tried to run to him, but the shadows seemed to come alive and began to surround her. Their movements were smooth and at the same time clumsy. She could hear whispers filling her mind, making her feel a terrible sense of disappearance. She fell. Her legs felt as heavy as stone, and she knew she couldn't fight any longer. Anton desperately tried to pull Lisa out of this circle of shadows. He grabbed her arm, trying to pull her back to the van. His body was tense, but his strength was gradually leaving him. The darkness that surrounded them seemed to have a power of its own, draining the life force from each of them. Danilo, who had remained confident until now, began to understand that the situation was hopeless. He grabbed Marina's hand and pulled her back to the bus, which was standing very close by. They tried to move as quickly as possible, but the darkness that was thickening around them seemed inescapable. "Let's run while we can!" Danilo shouted, his voice full of despair. Marina, frightened and almost losing her strength, obeyed him, although she felt that every step was becoming more and more difficult for her. Anton saw Danilo and Marina approaching the bus and tried to pull Liza along, but the shadows wouldn't let her go. They seemed to entangle her legs, stopping her movement. She felt a cold wash over her body and a whisper fill her mind, making her forget who she was. "Lisa, hold on!" Anton shouted, but his voice was drowned in an ominous noise. He could feel his own strength leaving him as the shadows began to move closer to him. Danilo and Marina got to the bus. Danilo quickly opened the door and pulled Marina inside. He turned to look at his friends, but all he saw was Anton standing in the dark, the shadows slowly engulfing him. His figure gradually merged with this darkness until it disappeared completely. Danilo closed the bus door and shouted to Marina to help him start the engine. Her hands were shaking as she tried to find the keys. She could hardly breathe. Tears were streaming down her face, and fear paralyzed every cell in her body. But they succeeded. The engine roared, and Danilo pressed the gas, trying to leave this ominous place as quickly as possible. The bus jerked away, and Danilo tried not to look back. They drove through the darkness, the shadows left behind, slowly dissolving into the thick night. The village of Zanurivka remained far away, but something in this place changed them forever. Marina was silently looking out the window, and Danilo was driving with concentration, not saying a word. The shadows that remained in the village took away those who came here to find answers. Those who remained were never the same again. The shadowless village took its new inhabitants, and their souls now belonged to this cursed place. Danilo and Marina drove silently in the dark. They left Zanurivka behind, but the feeling of relief did not come. Their hands were still shaking, their hearts were still beating wildly, and the same ominous whispers they had heard in the abandoned village sounded in their heads. The motor hummed, the tires rustled on the road, but Marina could not shake the impression that the darkness was still following them. She dared to look around, glancing out the rear window, but saw only the thick night and the shadows of the forest disappearing into the darkness. "They stayed there, didn't they?" said Marina, trying to control herself. Her voice was so quiet that Danilo barely heard it. "I don't know," he answered, not taking his eyes off the road. "But we have already left there. This must mean that we are saved." He pressed the gas pedal harder, trying to leave all memories of Zanurivka as far as possible. But even under the hum of the engine, they heard something else, something that filled their thoughts. The whisper did not leave them, even when they had already moved far from the village. Later, Marina noticed something strange. Her hands in her lap seemed too dim, as if the light from the flashlight couldn't reach her skin. She raised her hand closer to her face and realized that her shadow It had simply disappeared. Neither in the light of the headlights nor from the flashlight, her body no longer cast shadows. "Danilo, look," she said, panicking. Her voice shook as she reached her hand forward to show that something was wrong. Danilo looked at her hand, and then at his own. He saw the same thing. Their shadows disappeared. His heart sank, and the feeling of horror, which had almost left him, once again covered his whole being. He knew that something remained with them, something invisible but terrible. "This is the village," he whispered. "It did not let us go." They drove on, trying to stay calm. But the longer they moved, the more they realized that the darkness they left in Zanarivka was inside themselves. She was not just part of the village. She became a part of them, and now something deep, invisible, connected them to this cursed place. An hour passed, and the road became familiar. They were approaching the city where they started their journey. The headlights of the minibus illuminated the side of the road, and for a moment, Danilo thought that everything might be normal. But suddenly, he noticed something in the rearview mirror, dark figures running behind them, remaining in the shadows of the trees. The shadows they left behind in Zanarivka were not going to let them go. "They're here," he said quietly, feeling his hands on the wheel begin to shake again. He didn't know how to fight it, didn't know how to save himself and Marina from something that couldn't be seen or touched. Marina looked back and also saw those shadows. They were getting closer, despite the speed of the minibus, and it seemed that with each meter they became clearer, as if gaining strength. "What should we do?" she shouted, unable to hide her panic. She could feel something invisible squeezing her chest, forcing her to lose hope. Danilo did not know the answer. He only knew that they could not stop, could not turn back. He pushed harder on the gas pedal, hoping that the speed would save them from these ghostly pursuers. They entered the city, where the streets were lit by lanterns. But something was wrong. No person, no light could warm them. The darkness stayed with them, and the shadows they had lost were now part of something bigger, something that refused to let them return to normal life. Danilo and Marina, having finally entered the city limits, stopped the minibus at an empty gas station. All around was quiet, and it seemed that here they could at least for a moment feel safe. Danilo turned off the engine, and the silence that followed was so deafening that even the sound of his own breathing seemed unusually loud. Marina cautiously looked at her reflection in the mirror. Her face looked pale, tired, but what scared her the most was that she still couldn't see her shadow. She raised her hand, turned the flashlight to her face, but did not see the usual reflection of the shadow. This void was as relentless as their fear. "We can't go home," she said quietly, meeting Danilo's gaze. "Something went with us. Something dark." Danilo sighed heavily, looking at her with uncertainty in his eyes. He didn't know what to do next. Their shadows remained in Zanarivka, and those that haunted them were something completely different, an echo of the place that wanted to drag them forever. It seemed to him that the darkness was an inevitable part of their present life, and he could not find a way out. "Perhaps we should go even further," he suggested, although he himself wasn't sure if this was the right decision. "We have to find a place where they can't find us, or something that will help us turn everything back." Marina nodded, but fear still gripped her heart. She remembered the words of the old legend they read about Zanarivka. It said that everyone who came under the influence of the shadows became a part of them forever. They will lose their shadow, and with it a part of their soul, until they disappear completely. She didn't want to believe it, but everything that happened confirmed these words. Suddenly their phones beeped. The dim light of the screens scattered the darkness in the bus cabin. Both received the message at the same time, and it was strange. Marina and Danilo looked at each other, and then looked at their phones. The message was from an unknown number. Its text was simple, but it sent a chill down their spines. "You will not be able to escape. Return the shadows or become part of them forever." Marina could not believe her eyes. Her hands shook as she showed Danilov the message. He, without saying a word, just nodded, and they realized that their attempts to escape were pointless. The darkness was inside them, and it wasn't going to go away. "Maybe we should go back," Danilo suggested, and his voice was quiet, almost broken. He looked into the night that surrounded them on all sides. If we return to Zanarivka, perhaps we can find the answer. Whatever it is, they want us back. Marina thought for a moment, and it seemed to her that she heard the same whisper that was in the village as an echo in her mind. She realized that there was no escaping it, and the only way to break free was to find a way to get back what they had lost. "Okay," she said, her voice quiet but determined. "We will return and find out what they want." Danilo started the engine, and they turned the minibus around to start again in the direction of Zanarivka. The night seemed endless, and the road back was full of doubt and fear. But they knew it was their only chance. The darkness left them with no choice, and now they had to go back to where it all began. Headlights cut through the night, but there were no shadows anywhere. They drove, and the shadows they left behind seemed to be waiting for them, ready to finish their work. The sinkhole was bringing them back to her, and this time she had no intention of letting them go. The minibus was moving along a winding forest road, and the darkness around them was getting thicker and thicker, as if the night itself wanted to swallow them in its arms. Danilo and Marina were silent. Neither of them knew what was waiting for them when they returned to Zanarivka, but they understood that there was no other way out. The shadows they lost and those that haunted them left no choice. They had to go back. When they finally neared the village, the darkness seemed to deepen and the air heavy and cold. The minibus drove through the abandoned gate, and Marina felt a chill run through her skin. This place reeked of death, secrets, and loss. The village was silent, and it seemed that even the trees froze in anticipation. Anton carefully stopped the car at the same place where they first got out. He and Marina looked at each other, and neither of them wanted to leave. But Marina sighed deeply and, gathering all her courage, opened the door. They got out of the car and almost immediately felt that something had changed. The darkness around the village seemed to come alive. The feeling of presence was not just fear, it became real. They felt that someone or something was watching their every move. Each step echoed in the depths of the night, and the whispers they had heard earlier began to grow louder again, like an ominous chorus coming from the darkness. "Where are our shadows?" Marina said quietly, looking down at her feet. The ground was empty, with no reflection from their bodies. She realized that their shadows were somewhere here in this village and they had to find a way to get them back. Danilo approached the old well in the center of the village, around which everything seemed to have stopped. He was looking into the dark well, and from there he could hear a low whisper calling them closer. "Maybe we need to go back to where it all started," he said, glancing at Marina. Her face was filled with fear, but she nodded, realizing that there was nowhere for them to retreat. Together they approached the well, and the whispers grew louder. The words didn't make sense, but their voices sounded like they were calling friends by name. Every sound entered their thoughts, and it seemed to them that they heard the voices of Anton, Liza, and Oleg, those whom they had left in this place. The voices mingled with the darkness, clouded their consciousness, and they felt their will weaken. "Do you hear that?" Marina asked, her eyes filled with tears. She could no longer distinguish between what was real and what was just an echo of their fears. "Yes, I hear," Danilo answered, his voice trembling. He looked into the darkness of the well and thought he saw movement there. It was as if the shadows they had lost floated on the bottom, beckoning them to come closer. Suddenly figures appeared from the darkness. These were the same shadows they had seen before, human outlines, but without faces, without details. They were getting closer, and it seemed that each of them had their own intention, their own goal. Danilo and Marina felt their hearts constrict with horror. "We have to go to them," Danilo said quietly, feeling the cold envelop his body. He understood that these shadows were parts of their souls that they had to get back, or they would never be able to be themselves again. Marina, barely standing on her feet from fear, took a step forward, coming closer to the shadows. They were nearby, dark, but as if they were alive. She thought she could hear her own voice coming from those shadows calling her back. Danilo also approached, and suddenly one of the shadows reached out to him. He stopped, his heart beating wildly, but he knew this was their only chance. He held out his hand in response, and at the same moment he felt a chill run through his entire body. Shadows entangled them, and for a moment, everything went dark. Consciousness left Danilo and Marina, and they felt as if they were falling into a deep abyss, where there was nothing but coldness and whispers. But after a moment, everything changed. Their shadows returned to them. They felt the part of their souls that had been lost fill the void again. They found themselves at the well, lying on the cold ground. Marina raised her head, looking at Danilo. His face was tired but alive. She looked down at the ground and saw that it was now casting a shadow again. Her heart filled with relief, and she realized that they had regained what they had lost. But the shadows that surrounded them were still there. They didn't disappear. They stared at them from the darkness, as if they weren't going to let them go. "We have to get out of here," Danilo said, getting to his feet and helping Marina up. They knew that they could not stay here any longer. They rushed towards the van, and the darkness behind them began to move, as if trying to stop them. But now they had their shadows, and they weren't about to give them up again. Danilo quickly started the engine, and they left the village without looking back. The light of the headlights cut through the night, and their shadows were now with them, reflected on the ground as before. They felt that a part of their lives remained in this village, but now they had a chance to start over, a chance to return to a normal life. Zanurivka is left behind, a mysterious village where shadows disappear. But now they knew the darkness could follow them anywhere, and though they got their shadows back, something in their souls remained empty, and that emptiness would always remind them of that night in the abandoned village where shadows and souls became one. Danilo and Marina escaped from the village, but the horror remained with them. They felt that Zanurivka still had her hands outstretched for their souls. The darkness they had experienced could no longer be simply forgotten, and their shadows now seemed as if they had not yet fully returned. The road led to the city, and they hoped that with the return of the shadows, everything would change, that the horrors would be left behind. But the night was thick and heavy, and the feeling of the presence of something evil never disappeared. Danilo, sitting behind the wheel, still felt eyes staring at him from the darkness. He didn't answer, but Marina could see that his hands on the steering wheel had turned pale, tightly gripping the rim. Marina looked into the mirror, trying to see at least something behind them. For a moment it seemed to her that the dark figures were standing just outside the window, casting their reflection on the windshield. Her heart clenched with fear. She closed her eyes and tried to breathe deeper, but the feeling that something was coming wouldn't let go. Suddenly, the bus jerked sharply as if someone had hit it from behind. Danilo, exclaiming in surprise, almost lost control but managed to straighten the car in time. Marina saw his face, frightened and sweaty. He was looking into the rearview mirror, not believing his own eyes. They're following us!" he rasped, his eyes fixed on the mirror. His voice was full of fear. In the darkness behind the bus, they saw shadows. There were more of them than in the village then. They became clearer, darker, and now moved faster. These were no ordinary shadows. They seemed to have a will of their own, an anger of their own, now directed at those who tried to escape. "No! No!" Marina pressed her hand to her mouth, her eyes filled with tears. She understood that they could not get rid of Zanurivka. This place stayed with them. It took a part of their soul, and now it demanded even more. The shadows were approaching. They were almost touching the minibus, and it seemed that the darkness was squeezing them like a trap. The feeling of a cold touch passed over Marina's back, as if an invisible hand had touched her shoulder. She couldn't stop the panic that gripped her, her heart beating to the beat of fear. Danilo pressed the gas harder, trying to get out of this nightmare, but the shadows seemed to engulf the road ahead. The light of the headlights began to fade, and the darkness, as if alive, was slowly closing in on them. The sense of irreversibility that night was so strong that it seemed as if they were falling into an abyss where there was no more light. Suddenly, Marina heard a voice, the same whisper that haunted them back in the village. It sounded right in her head, and the words were clear, cruel. "You will never run away. You belong to us." These words, cold and merciless, tore through her mind. She felt a part of her consciousness begin to obey this voice, begin to disappear into the darkness. Danilo also began to hear whispers. He tried to focus on the road, but the voices were so loud that he thought they were just sitting there, whispering right in his ears. He saw how the shadows were approaching, how they seemed to spread over the ground and reach out to them with their cold hands. "Marina, we have to do something!" he shouted, but his voice was hollow, as if all the air had been sucked out of the bus cabin. He could feel the panic coming over him, the pressure around him becoming unbearable. Marina understood that they would not be able to escape. She looked into the shadows and thought she saw a face. There were the faces of their friends, Anton, Lisa, Oleg. They were not alone. Their friends had become part of that darkness, and now they followed them, calling to them. "We have to stop," she said, her voice almost breaking. "If we keep running, they won't leave us." Danilo looked at her. His eyes were full of horror, but he nodded. He understood that they couldn't just run away from it. He slammed on the brakes and the bus stopped in the middle of the road. The shadows stopped with them, and all the darkness of the world seemed to gather around them, awaiting their movement. Marina got off the bus. Her legs were shaking, but she forced herself to go forward. She could see shadows approaching, hear whispers filling her head, but she knew there was no other way. "We'll get back what you want," she said, her voice stronger than she'd expected. "But you have to leave us." The shadows stopped, and everything was quiet for a moment. It seemed that even the whispers had disappeared. Danilo was standing next to Marina, holding her hand. Their shadows lay on the ground. Now they were with them again, but they were not the shadows they had before. They were part of the darkness, and now they knew that part would stay with them forever. The shadows slowly began to dissipate, as if losing their interest. They were retreating, and it seemed that the night was beginning to thin again. But Marina and Danilo knew that this was only the beginning. The darkness has left its mark on their souls, and now they will always carry a part of Zanurivka with them. They returned to the bus, and Marina sat in the passenger seat. Danilo started the engine and slowly drove forward. The darkness still surrounded them, but now it was quieter, as if content with what it had. This night was endless, and even when the first signs of dawn began to appear on the horizon, Marina and Danilo knew that they would never be able to completely escape from what happened in Zanurivka. The shadows remained with them, and with them, the fear that one day the darkness would come again to finish what was begun. Dawn slowly cut through the darkness, and its weak light, like a gray haze, barely dispelled the remnants of the night. Danilo and Marina drove in silence, watching how the surrounding world began to gain color. But even the sun's rays breaking through the thick clouds could not warm the cold that Zanurivka left behind. The shadows that were now with them felt like a burden, like invisible chains that dragged them deeper and deeper into their fears. Marina could not take her eyes off her shadow, which was reflected on the panel of the bus. It was her shadow, but there was something wrong with it. She seemed thicker, darker, as if she lived a life of her own, separate from hers. For a moment, she thought the shadow was moving differently than she was, and the thought caused another panic attack. "Danilo," she said, her voice was as fragile as ice on a lake. "Do you see that?" Danilo quickly glanced at her shadow, and then at his own. He also noticed that their shadows had become more material, almost corporeal, and worst of all, they no longer mirrored their movements perfectly. When Marina raised her hand, her shadow remained still for a moment, then, with a slight delay, repeated her movement. They're not like before," Danilo whispered, unable to believe his eyes. His heart began to beat faster again, and his hands shook on the steering wheel. Their shadows seemed to have a will of their own. They moved on their own, though not always and not too clearly, but it was enough for the understanding of this horror to slowly seep into their minds. Marina felt the fear begin to return, like a poison slowly spreading through her veins. "We have to stop," she said. "Something is wrong. They are here with us. They have not left us." Danilo nodded, and they stopped on the side of the road. The forest stood nearby, and even nature seemed to sense that something was wrong. The birds did not sing, and the wind did not rustle the leaves. They got off the bus, and their shadows came out too, but not exactly in line with their movements. It was as if they had their own bodies that simply followed them, but with unseen intentions. Marina stood on the road and watched as her shadow fell to the ground, and then, as if of its own free will, slowly began to stretch in different directions. She thought she saw features, eerily blurred, distorted, as if the shadow was trying to reflect something she couldn't quite hold. "It's them," Marina whispered, feeling the cold once again envelop her heart. They're still here. Danilo felt that they would not be able to simply return home and continue living as before. Something went wrong that night. Something stayed with them forever. He looked at his own shadow and saw it slowly begin to rise, not following his movements but separating from the ground. She looked at him, and there was a terrible, empty look in her, a look without eyes, but full of evil. "What should we do?" he asked, his voice breaking, and it seemed like he could barely breathe. He could feel his own shadow subduing him, pulling him in, and it was impossible to escape. Marina did not know the answer. She felt her own shadow rise up behind her, touching her shoulder with a cold, almost icy black touch. It felt like a part of herself was no longer under her control. She realized with horror that Zanurivka did not just stay with them, she became a part of their souls. Suddenly, an understanding came to her mind. The shadows no longer belonged to them. They became independent, alive, and hostile. They wanted to go back to where they came from, but now they were dragging their carriers, Danilo and Marina, along with them. They were doomed to belong to this horror until they found a way to turn the shadows back. "We can't stay here," Marina whispered, her eyes brimming with tears, but her voice resolute. "We must return to Zanurivka and find out what they want. Otherwise, we will simply disappear." Danilo looked at her and nodded. They knew that they would never be able to completely escape from this place. The sinkhole swallowed them up and was not going to let go now. They got back on the bus and started the engine again, heading back to the source of the darkness that had taken their shadows and now demanded more. The darkness remained with them, but now it had a name and a purpose. Their journey back to Zanurivka was inevitable, and they knew that what awaited them could be even worse than the horrors they had already experienced. The bus started, and the shadows as before followed. They were silent witnesses to their own doom, their lost souls, and a fear that would never go away.